joined in the method for actually sharing the screen. Pretty arcane. Okay, so I don't know who's here. The YouTube system for sharing your actual desktop is pretty garbage. So I won't be able to see anything anyone says whatsoever, which is just fantastic. So after this, I'll have to literally start a new live take questions, which is just awesome. So I'll do that for anybody who happens to show up. If you can't hear any audio coming from me, means I have to focus that. Gaudy microphone. Okay, this should help. As attractive as this really stupid thing is. So we'll just give another minute or so for anybody else who's going to show up to show up. And so apologies that this is going to be odd. I think I might have to do Twitch in the future, although that invites the public in, which is the worst. All right, things are going to get wacky until I get the presentation over. Yep, there we go. So, no, wait. One more second. New technology is great. Okay, so that should get me to where I need to be. So why don't we get going? All right. Where we left off was Bracciopods. So let's finish talking here. The Bracciopods, we had just done this. They are animals characterized by the lophophore. So you can see a distinct feeding apparatus on them that is a set of tentacles. So these tentacles allow for feeding, and they have shells that look like clam shells, but they're oriented 90 degrees compared to how a clam is oriented in its shell. Well, there are only about 300 species extant now. In the past, there were many, many more. 250 million years ago, they were extremely common. We've found over 30,000 different species based on shell morphology. So, much more common in the past than now, victims of mass extinctions. And then phylum Cyclospora. So Cyclospora is a relatively new phylum. These are extremely small organisms. They're only about the size of a period if you're messing with font size 12. So definitely barely visible to the naked eye. They are acoelomates. So aside from Platyhelminthes, these are the only other acoelomate we know of. And they were found on the mouth parts of lobsters. So they're commensal organisms that live on the mouth parts of lobsters. So that's kind of cool. They molt. So no, the cyclophorans don't molt. When lobsters molt, the cyclophorans do some specific actions. Dwarf males will emerge after the molt, and the male finds the female on the lobster, and he will fertilize the females, and it's really wacky. So basically, the male consists of a brain and reproductive organs. Not much to it. The female is fertilized while they are still developing in their mother, which is also pretty wacky. They have free swimming larvae. So, yeah, pretty wacky. If you're looking at the picture there at the bottom, number 2 is a dwarf male that has attached to this female and fertilized her female larvae developing within her. So, extremely weird organisms. And that's representing the last of that lecture. So, let's get the next one going. Invertebrates 2. Okay, so some artifact of this broadcast appears to be the freaking out of the mouse. So I am unfortunately unable to draw or write. Let's see if I can get that fixed. Got my pen, got my digitizer pad. Okay. Think I'm going to have that fixed now. Yep. Invertebrates 2. So we're going to start off talking about the next slide on invertebrates with phylum Mollusca. Phylum Mollusca is pretty sweet. They are an extremely diverse phyla of organisms. They include chitons, snails, clams, octopus, and squid. And they're found in deep water from 7,000 meters all the way up to tidal pools that go dry between high tide and low tide. So they are extremely diverse. They are second only to arthropods in the number of species. So there's something like 93,000 described species of mollusks. I don't know what that 664 is. I think I must have mistakenly typed it while getting all this ready. So we can just ignore 664. These are of great economic significance. As you imagine, we do eat quite a bit of different mollusks. In addition to that, one of the worst species today that has invaded the U.S. ecosystems is the zebra mussel. Zebra mussel being an organism that is invasive. It was brought into the U.S., into the Great Lakes, probably by a container ship. And when it blasted its ballast out, emptied its ballast, when it unloaded, it probably unloaded some zebra mussels into the Great Lakes. And from there, they've infiltrated nearly every freshwater ecosystem on the East Coast. And they are headed west. So good times. These happen to be an intermediate host for most platyhelminthian parasites. So whether it's a clam or a snail or something, they tend to be intermediate hosts, which is kind of fascinating. And there's pearls, of course, because they're under extreme economic significance because fancy jewelry, I guess. A body plan of a mollusk. So, no matter what kind of mollusk it is, they all have some basic features. One, they have the foot. This muscular foot is a major part of the phylum. It's a either locomotory or attachment modification of the body. So it is allowing them to either move or stay stationary. So it's a modification for attachment or locomotion. In some species, the foot secretes a mucus, and that they are then able to move on that mucus. The body where we find all the organs is called the visceral mass. Now, it is worth mentioning that mollusks are eucoelomates, meaning they have a full-on body cavity. However, it is difficult to see because the organs are suspended in a visceral mass. This is where we find the digestive system, and the stomach and the anus. If you see in this picture, we have, where are we? Yeah, we have the opening with the mouth. This is a prototypical snail, the digestive system, and then the ending with the anus. There tends to be a cavity here. This cavity is called the mantle cavity, A lot of these things are oriented differently just depending on the species. In this species, it poops into its mantle cavity and it also breathes in its mantle cavities. For species like this marine snail, their gills are in the mantle cavity. These tend to have a circulatory system that we refer to as an incomplete circulatory system or an open circulatory system. An open circulatory system versus closed is pretty simple. Humans have a closed circulatory system in which you have a heart and then blood vessels coming from the heart that then go back to the heart, right? And all organs are fed off of these blood vessels. In an open circulatory system, you'll have a heart, and then you'll have blood vessels of indeterminate length. It depends on the species that open up. So you'll tend to have a blood vessel connected to some sort of breathing organ. In this case, it's the gills. And then you have the pumping organ, the heart, and then it just opens up and bathes organs in a pool of blood. So you can see this right here. Oftentimes, the opening where the blood bathing occurs is called a blood sinus. All right. The mantle, right? The mantle is a specific structure that lines the visceral mass. In this image, it's in blue. The mantle secretes the shell. So most mollusks have a shell. The mantle is responsible for secreting the shell. The radula is present in a number of different mollusks. Not all, however. The radula is a modified feeding appendage. So it's a rasping tongue. Let's see. Okay, there we go. A rasping tongue. What that means when you look at this image here, the radula has these little projections. These projections are, you could call them teeth, but teeth, what, I don't know what's happening here. Wow, that is just classy. All right. The teeth are not true teeth, however, because true teeth are bone. These are just sort of a mineralized, modified structure. You do not find a radula in bivalves, the clams, and mussels, and you do not find a radula in some nudibranchs, which are basically sea slugs. So no radula in bivalves, and some nudibranchs don't have the radula. So we have our open circulatory system. We have our mantle, our visceral mass. We have a complete digestive system. That's why we have a mouth and an anus. What else do I want to talk about? These organisms do have an organ now for nephridia. So we have nephridia. Where are we? Here we go. These are filtering organs. So basically analogous to the kidney. So we have the capability to filter the blood with an organ. So this is an honest to goodness organ now. In Platyhelminthes, the nephridia were those flame cells, modified parts of the digestive system, responsible for getting waste out of the Platyhelminthes. Now we have a full-on filtering organ, and we also have reproductive organs. Some species of mollusks are hermaphrodites, some are separate sexes. So we can have separate sexes, or we can have hermaphrodites. Both are present. Separate sexes is more common in mollusca than hermaphrodites, but both are present. Fertilization tends to be external. So these mollusks practice what we call spray and pray fertilization in most species, where the males eject their sperm into the water and the females eject their eggs into the water. And fertilization happens when they happen to meet. We have trochophore larvae. So this puts these square in Lophotrochozoa. Remember, that's one of the two clades of invertebrates. So these belong to Lophotrochozoa because they have trochophore larvae that are free swimming and become part of the ocean plankton. Some freshwater, well, in a lot of freshwater species of mollusks, we have a larva called a veliger, which is a interesting stage. So we have the initial larvae, multicellular trochophore larvae, right? And then we have the veliger or veliger, whatever you want to say, and it has the beginnings of a foot and mantle and shell. So it is a second stage of development. So in the most mollusks, the first stage is this trochophore larvae, and then the second stage is a veliger. Some veligers are modified for parasitism, even though the adult is not a parasite. Okay, continuing forward, we'll be looking at different classes of mollusks. We'll start off with chitons and gastropods, right? Chitons correspond to this little species here. They tend to be sessile organisms that use their foot to attach to substrates. Gastropods includes snails and slugs. So here's a beautiful little marine slug, and there's a snail. Wow, I attached that to cephalopods. So there we go. we'll just ignore this. Bivalves includes clams and mussels. And lastly, cephalopods, likely the most exotic of the uh, mollusks. Cephalopods have a number of unique adaptations compared to their other mollusk brethren, which makes them, being mollusks, that much more amazing. I love cephalopods. So, chitons are pretty simple, right? In fact, I could just knock them out. They have 8 interlocking plates that make up their shell. They have a unsegmented body. The plates kind of make it look like they have segments, but their body is indeed an unsegmented body. And they use their foot for some locomotion and primarily for attachment. They can basically use their foot as kind of like the little plastic rubber suckers that we have that, attach to like the glass of your fish tank. So they can create suction with their foot in order to attach to surfaces. Pretty simple organisms. That's honestly about all we need to know about the chitons. So let's move on to gastropods. Gastropods are pretty neat organisms. I know nobody can see my face, so like I said, we'll start up a second live in order to take questions. We'll make sure to do that, you know, a little later after we do lectures. So probably around, I don't know, noon, so we can spend the last 10 minutes doing this. So gastropods. These are the snails and slugs. All right. For those gastropods with shells, the shells exhibit something that we call torsion. Basically, what we have is that the anus and mantle cavity are moved anterior. So instead of being at the rear of the animal, they basically open up at the front, open in the shell. So the mantle cavity is still a cavity in the shell, and they open up in the shell on the head end. That means gastropods poop on their own heads. Kind of fun. Um, their shells are twisted. So not only has their digestive system twisted so that it opens up and they poop onto their own heads, their shells are twisted. So not all gastropods have shells on account of these, including sea slugs. So pretty neat. Nematocysts can be found in some marine slugs. Whoa, hey, come back here. There we go. However, nematocysts are only developed in Cnidaria. If you have nematocysts, they come from a cnidarian. So basically, these sea slugs feed on cnidarians, like anemones. And they incorporate those cnidarian nematocysts, the stinging cells into their own body. So they take those cnidarian cells and develop a mutualistic symbiosis with those specific cells from the cnidarian. That's kind of cool. Now, in addition to snails and slugs, we can also find the abalone, which kind of looks like a type of marine snail, and also the nudibranchs. So these are just additional gastropods. Gastropoda tends to have eyes. So they tend to have a head, and then they have eyes on stalks, which are really just kind of like tentacles. They're highly mobile and allow them to move their eyes around to see in different directions. All right. They are a pretty diverse group of mollusca. We've described over 40,000 extant species. So lots of different mollusks. Whoa, what you doing there? Come back here. All right. On to bivalva. So the bivalves. These are a specific type of mollusk having two shells. So bivalva. So this is a Glochidia. It's pretty cool. In freshwater species, this is that veliger stage. However, this is the veliger stage that is parasitic. Basically, it attaches to gills of fish. This is pretty useful. They can feed on blood, get all the nutrients they need, and in addition, the fish are the vector of dispersal. So fish are much more motile than a standard trochophore larvae or a standard veliger. So fish allow significantly larger dispersal areas. That's pretty cool. They do not represent parasites for their whole life cycle. It's really only about 20 to 70 days, depending on the species, before they detach and then develop into the full bivalve. There's a lot that you do in lab regarding the mollusks. They have pretty similar features to all the basic mollusk the features we talked about. So they have the visceral mass, where we find the digestive system. They have the incomplete, the open circulatory system. They have the complete digestive system. If you look at the standard bivalve, you have the fusion point, the two shells, each lined with a mantle. And then a feature of these mollusks is the siphons. One being an incurrent siphon that allows them to pull pull water into the mantle cavity for feeding. And then the excurrent siphon, which allows them to expel waste out of the cavity and the shell. Now, they may not look it, but a lot of bivalves, most bivalves do have eyes or photosensors. So in this image up here, we can actually see their photosensors, these dark eye spots along there. So not exactly superior image forming eyes, but it does allow them to sense the light. Some bivalves have more developed eyes than others. So, the Colorado River has a problem with loss of species diversity, and that is due to dams, right? So clams rely on water current to get new food, and taking a sip of coffee. They rely on the water current to get new food, and they rely on the water current for dispersal. And dams pretty much kind of stop all that. So dams can create anoxic environments down in the bottom layer where clams normally attach, and they can get not enough oxygen at the bottom of reservoirs, and they cannot distribute. And basically, dams are killing clams in freshwater ecosystems. So, yay, ending on a upper. All right. So, pearls, bivalves are economically significant. What that means is that we can make a bunch of money off them, not just in food. People eat all sorts of bivalves, but also in the form of pearls. Pearls are actually an immune defense. They're the product of an immune defense. Basically, when you have some kind of irritant between the mantle and the shell being secreted, the clam secretes a substance around the irritant in order to create a smoother, less irritating surface that it then pulls into the tissues. So the tissues surround the irritant, and it continues secreting defensive layers around the irritant, and that is the pearl. So you do have to kill clams in order to get your pearls. Pearl mussels are endangered. I use clams as shorthand for all of these. Clams and mussels have subtle differences. Kind of enough subtle differences that I'm not really that concerned with you knowing all the differences between clams and mussels, which is kind of why I am incorrectly shorthanding everything as clams. So allow me to correct that. Pearl mussels. Actually, about 90% of the species of pearl mussels have become extinct, which blows. And that's been in the last 100 years. So maybe we could stop exploiting them economically. I don't know. They're farming these now, so that's a little bit better. If you have the chance to get pearls, if you're the sort of person who wears pearls, go for farmed pearls over the wild pearls, because wild pearls or natural pearls means that they went out, dived down to pearl mussels, minding their own business, living in as a natural part of their ecological system, and then murdered them for their pearls. So, wild and natural pearls, they try and make them sound good, but they're identical to farmed pearls. And at least farmed pearls aren't removing them from their natural environment. This is a picture of Colorado River clams. So there's a species of clam called the Colorado clam. Lives in the Colorado River. Now, they live in the delta where the Colorado River meets the Gulf of Mexico. So this little river delta, Colorado River Delta. This is well, it was a productive ecosystem. Now, the reason it is not a productive ecosystem is because dams and water use for, houses and so residential water use, agricultural, so residential, commercial, agricultural water use. So this has basically stopped water from actually flowing through the delta to the Gulf. The river no longer enters the Gulf. That means that the few bits of water in that delta have become hypersaline without sources of fresh water to continually flush through the water in the delta. Basically, whatever water is in the delta evaporates, leaving behind much more saline environment. The Colorado clam, at last check, there was maybe like a few in the wild. They're likely extinct. This is an image in a delta, which is basically an island of dead clams. Hooray, humanity! In the past 30 odd years, there's been a movement to release water from the reservoirs occasionally to try and get the Colorado River to actually reach the delta, but they only do that occasionally, and it really doesn't help limit the hypersaline deltas. So, not ideal. In the 1930s, this was a thriving ecosystem. And so if you look at shells from clams that died in the 30s, you can find evidence that there was significantly more fresh water and oxygen in this ecosystem. So hopefully there will be restoration efforts. I guess we'll just have to see. All right, on to my favorite mollusks, the cephalopods. These are to scientifically characterize them, awesome. Yeah, okay. So cephalopods are amazing. These are extremely well developed. I don't know how you'd put that. Advanced organisms compared to the rest of the mollusks. They have large brains, extremely well-developed eyes. There's a lot of research into, their intellectual capacity. So the foot of a cephalopod is now modified, and it's modified to have tentacles, right? And these tentacles have hooks in suckers, and these are for capturing prey. So these are pretty sweet organisms. They are active predators. Uh, there is a difference between tentacle and arm when talking about cephalopods. A tentacle has suckers at the end only, whereas arms have suckers all the way down. So all along the limb. However, oftentimes we use tentacle and arm interchangeably. They have a siphon, kind of like the clam. So if you look at the body, nearly all cephalopod species are unshelled. Only the most primitive still have a shell. I'm drawing up sort of a standard squid or cuttlefish. So this is their modified mantle. We have a small mantle cavity around here, and we have a excurrent siphon. So then we have the rest of the head. Throw some arms down on there and a well-developed eye. And that is my adorable little cephalopod. The excurrent siphon allows it to jet water out of the mantle cavity. This allows for extremely rapid backwards locomotion. The only shelled species of cephalopod that is extant is the nautilus. This tends to be a deep sea species. They are the most primitive, the most basal of the cephalopods. So their locomotory their locomotory methods is limited specifically to the siphon, the jetting. Whereas a lot of cephalopods, for instance, squid and cuttlefish, have modifications. There we go. Okay, so they'll have some sort of fin for more slow, delicate movements. Octopus, right, are pretty simple cephalopods. Well, I wouldn't call them simple. There we go. Their main locomotion method is crawling with arms. So their arms are their main locomotion. They still jet with their excurrent siphons when necessary, but yeah, which is pretty cool. Cephalopods have chromatophores, which are essentially color changing cells. So these color changing cells allow them to produce a variety of different colors and patterns on their body. The pigment cells of these chromatophores allow them to vary color and pattern. They're most famous as adaptations for cryptic coloration, camouflage. However, there are species that use this for communication, and there's even evidence that there are species that use their chromatophores as emotional expression, which is kind of cool. Well, actually, extremely cool. So, compared to all other mollusks, their brain is incredibly well advanced. Like extremely well advanced. Well advanced. These are learning species. You can teach these species to do different tasks. They have an extremely well developed eye. One might call it a superior eye to vertebrates. It is an eye so different that it is not homologous, it is analogous to vertebrate eyes. That eye having similar features, right? It has a, uh, a, a, a focusing lens. It has a retina, right, where the photosensors are. But the nervous layer is behind the retina, such that they allow the entire retina to be used for image forming. Whereas with a vertebrate eye, there's my little lens. There's a terrible eye picture. You have the retina, and on top of the retina are the actual nervous cells that communicate that information. And so when you need to have that optic nerve, the vertebrate eyes have a blind spot. So this is why the eyes are analogous rather than homologous. Uh, a, so a product of convergent evolution. So that's kind of cool. These are amazing. There's a lot of research going into cephalopod intelligence. It's just badass. Uh, Reproduction in cephalopods is pretty cool. They have internal fertilization, so separate from just about all other mollusks. What happens is the male has a spermatophore, which is kind of like a little sperm packet. So this sperm packet, the male takes one of his arms and removes the sperm packet from the mantle. It develops in the mantle. They pull it out of their mantle, and then they insert it into the mantle of a female. So here's a pair of cuttlefish mating. They will grab onto each other, and then the male will use his sexon arm to transfer the spermatophore packet from his mantle into her mantle. Kind of cool. The males will often, competing males will remove the spermatophore of a different male. I don't know. These are just the coolest organisms. Let's see what I can do. I want to blank the screen out because I have run out of writing stuff. Maybe give a second because this is live and people might be taking notes. It's 11:10, so we'll be picking up. We've got about an hour left on lecture, and then at noon for the last 10 minutes, we will switch, and I'll do an additional live YouTube broadcast and email out that link again. And that way you'll actually be able to see my face and I can see your chats in order to actually answer questions. The YouTube method of broadcast, when you see the chats, has no actual method that I can see for desktop display. So I can't show a PowerPoint and see your comments at the same time. So if you have questions, make sure to keep them until the end. Okay, so cephalopods. A couple of more advanced features about cephalopods. They have a closed circulatory system, which is an amazing adaptation compared to the fact that all other mollusks, every other class of mollusks, has an open circulatory system with blood sinuses. Cephalopods have a closed circulatory system with blood contained in vessels. And another unique feature to the cephalopods is, in most species, the presence of the ink sac. Basically, this is a pigmented fluid and it can be expelled, right? The ink sac is located, if you look at the mantle cavity, the ink sac will be a little specialized secretory gland that can release ink into the mantle cavity, and then it can be squirted out via the excurrent siphon. So oftentimes predator avoidance will involve not just a jet propulsion away from the predator, but also a cloud of ink being expelled to hide that cephalopod. So that's pretty amazing. So this picture here, even though we've covered it up with writing, shows the ink cloud being expelled from the excurrent siphon. And then I have a few amazing animated pictures. So I love this GIF right here. It shows the cryptic abilities of those chromatophores. Another unique feature of cephalopods is the ability to alter the texture of their outer layering. So you can see that the texture is extremely similar. So this is actually an image in reverse, in which an octopus attached to a structure and then altered itself to be completely cryptic. This image down below here is a cuttlefish, not a squid. And it is using its chromatophores to create alternating patterns for communication, which is also kind of badass. And then here, another example of a cuttlefish doing the alteration of skin texture. Then here is a mimic octopus expressing the amazing intelligence of these animals by being able to mimic different organisms. So depending on the situation, they will mimic the sort of external features of different organisms. Here In this first picture, we have a flounder, and then the mimic octopus creating the basically external the silhouette. Thank you, of a flounder. Here, the mimic octopus is mimicking the silhouette of a lionfish. And here, the mimic octopus is mimicking the basic body of a venomous coral snake. And it will use its arms to mimic the body movements of these different species. So they are amazing. And this is one of my favorite comics, Southeast Asian Sea Life. So mimic octopus, mimic octopus, mimic octopus, mimic octopus, mimic octopus, mimic octopus. So, I love that. And then down at the bottom, 2 mimic octopuses. I don't know. One of my favorite comics, XKCD. People who read XKCD like to pretend they are extremely intelligent compared to normal books. Okay, so this is another favorite of mine. We'll see if this link works. I truly hope it does. This is a cuttlefish in a laboratory, and they are feeding it a crab. And of course, it looks like it's. Oh, hey, okay. So it has just captured the crab.
Changes color when it grabs the snack. That doesn't make perfect sense because it seems to make it very conspicuous. So one theory is that it's just a signal of
it's changed color away from its cryptic coloration. It's changed color away from its cryptic coloration once capturing the prey, and it's hypothesized that this is actually emotional expression. So, cephalopods are considered extremely advanced when it comes to animal cognition. So I love that. And then we have just a little splash page with the 4 varieties of cephalopods. So nautilus have many tentacles and a large external shell. Squid have elongated, thin internal shells called a pin, so that their body is kind of rigid, but their shell is internal. Cuttlefish also have an internal pin. In fact, if you own a bird, you've probably given them cuttlefish pins. So that's kind of cool. Then lastly, octopus, they do not have an internal pin, which allows them to really squeeze through just about anything that their eyeballs could fit through. They're pretty amazing organisms. I love cephalopods so much. All right, now we'll move on to the next phylum, Annelida. Annelida is a phylum that includes a variety of classes. Generally, we refer to, like, if you say worm, you're probably referring to an annelid. We're going to actually go through the different classes of annelids. So the first one to talk about is Polychaeta. So these are marine worms. These are the largest class of annelids with over 10,000 different species described. The Polychaeta, poly means many, and chaeta refers to hairs. They have these little extensions, right? So most annelids have what we call a segmented body. Segment actually has a specific biological term, biological meaning. So a segmented body means something very specific. So some of them appear segmented, and some of them are segmented. These organisms are pretty sweet. These little extensions here are called parapodia. They are extremely pronounced in the polychaetes, and these are generally where we find our hair-like extensions. So the chaetae. Chaetae have a variety of different appearances and functions. Some of them are rigid. They can be for attachment. They can also be used for locomotion, kind of like walking around on peg legs almost, which is pretty cool. So that's actually really number 3 there. So we passed over prostomium. So basically, in a lot of polychaetes, the first body segment is referred to as a prostomium. It is a modified segment, and it is basically the head, including well-developed sensory structures and a nervous system. So they have sensory structures. This can include eyes, and it can include various antennae. And even little sensory structures associated with touch. We'd call these structures sensory palps. So, prostomium describes the fact that they have a well-developed head with well-developed sensory structures. Some, but not all, have trochophore larvae. So, pretty cool. When describing the chaetae, a rigid chaetae would be referred to as a bristle or a needle. Oh, hey. So that's pretty cool. These are chitinous structures. So these are not mineralized like calcium bones. They are chitinous. Chitin being a carbohydrate, basically chains of glucose similar to the cellulose in plant cell walls. So yeah, trochophore larvae in some of these organisms that join the plankton. Some can actually reproduce via asexual budding. So again, that's good in stable environments. Pretty cool. This is actually an image of a small female polychaete. She's probably either around here or even off screen in the picture. And then the long tentacle behind her is actually a gamete-filled breakaway segment. So gamete segments. This is seen in marine polychaetes because you can develop these in water without having to worry about them. So once a year, the species that have these gamete segments will swim up into the more shallower water column and release their segments for fertilization. The males are very small. It's generally, the breeding is associated with moonlight and the phases of the moon, which is pretty cool. All right, on to class Oligochaeta. The oligochaetes are the segmented worms and the leeches. So, earthworm is your gold star example. There are more than 3,000 species of oligochaetes. Most are terrestrial and freshwater. Their parapodia are highly reduced compared to their polychaete cousins, generally not extensions, and they generally don't have like long needle-like bristles. So you tend not to even say that they have parapodia. The parapodia are the fleshy extensions that contain them. So the chaetae are actually just embedded in the body. So they're embedded in the segments and no fleshy extension containing the chaetae. The chaetae are short and they are generally not nearly as developed. They all have these chaetae. Now, since the chaetae are extremely short, they are not used for locomotion. Locomotion is muscular in nature. So, muscular locomotion, and that is via peristalsis, peristaltic contractions. So, peristalsis is pretty simple. They have along their body circular muscles like rings, and then longitudinal muscles. So the longitudinal muscles will contract and shorten, causing the worm to squish the length, and the rings will contract and become thinner. So when an earthworm moves, it will, so here's my earthworm, right? A portion of the earthworm will sort of get big and fat, and then it will extend that fat area in order to move forward. So this is peristalsis. Think your esophagus. Your esophagus, when you swallow, exhibits peristaltic transport of the food. So peristalsis is their muscular locomotion. Pretty neat. The circular muscles contract in the anterior end, allowing the segments to get thinner and move forward. And the the thickening of the worm allows them to sort of allow their body to follow the anterior portion. So that's kind of cool. They have these setae on the anterior end of the body that allow them to sort of anchor during this so that they don't just wiggle around in one place. So the Cetae/Chetae. So all right, so that's peristaltic motion. Most of these annelids are hermaphrodites containing both sexes. The modified segment for reproduction and fertilization is called the clitellum. You can see it in earthworms extremely easily. It's this sort of fat area here. During reproduction, the clitellum secretes a very thick and sticky mucus. Oh. And they kind of adhere each other's clitellums together. So this earthworm at this point is excreting sperm to fertilize the eggs in this clitellum. And this earthworm here is secreting sperm from this end to fertilize eggs in that clitellum. So illustrating how, of course, that they are hermaphroditic. They will secrete a mucus cocoon in which they lay their eggs. So which is pretty cool. That cocoon protects the eggs and allows them to develop into larvae. So that's pretty cool. Leeches were once considered a separate class, a different class from Oligochaeta. However, molecular evidence has shown that they do in fact belong to the Oligochaetes, whereas the earthworms had over 10,000 or no, over 3,000 species. The leeches, by comparison, are much less diverse. There's only about 500 species. There's no Chetae or Cetae, however you want to say it, except in one single species. So there's also no septum. So let's see if I wanted to get a blank space real quick. So if you look at an earthworm being segmented worms, they have repeating body segments. Wow, okay, thank you. That just went all the way away. I appreciate that. Repeating body segments. What that means is that in a given segment, you will have a portion of the digestive system, and you will have little paired nephridia for excreting waste, and you'll have a portion of the circulatory system, and just every segment shares that structure. So these are segments with repeating organs or structures in them. These are repeating body segments. They are separated from one another by a sort of tissue barrier called a septum. Plural septa. So the segments are actually physically separated. So This is true segmentation. So this is exhibited by the segmented earthworms. Pretty cool. In leeches, we have no septa. So there's no septa separating the segments. That's a major differentiating feature between leeches and the other oligochaetes. Many leeches will secrete an anesthetic and anticoagulant because there are a lot of leeches that are parasitic. In fact, if I say the word leech, you think of the blood-feeding leech. So a freshwater species of oligochaete that attaches to various different kinds of organisms and bites in to access a blood vessel, and they'll secrete an anesthetic and anticoagulant to both limit the body's ability to feel them attached and limit immune responses and behavioral responses to their attachment. And then the anticoagulant in order to prevent the blood from coagulating and sealing off the wound that the leech made in order to feed. So they actually depend on the bacteria in their guts for digestion of blood meals. There we go. So the blood digestion is done by their flora. The bacterial gut flora, which is pretty neat. There are indeed free-living leeches. So there are non-parasitic leeches. Feature of leeches, differentiating feature of leeches is they have sort of a temporal appearance of clitellum. So whereas earthworms have their clitellum at all times, leeches only develop the clitellum during reproductive season. Whoa, hey, no. So it's only during their reproductive season that a clitellum will develop. Leeches are hermaphrodites like their earthworm cousins. Leeches have actually become medically important again. So once upon a time, a leech was medically important. This was during the time when humans thought diseases were caused by something called humors. There were good humors and bad humors. These were essentially fluids in the body. Good humors were good for maintaining health. Bad humors caused sickness, and they'd attach a leech to the body to suck out the bad humors. Obviously, this is not at all how that works. So, but the anticoagulant and anesthetic secreted by the leeches turns out to have some very important features. Leeches can be extremely useful when reattaching a severed finger. What you do is you put the leech on either side of the attachment, and it will secrete its anticoagulant, because one of the biggest problems with reattaching a severed thing like a finger is that in the stump, the blood vessels will seal because there's a wound. So they'll have their clotting cascade in which they reflexively shorten and seal and clot. So if you put leeches on either side of the reattached blood vessels, they'll actually prevent the clotting cascade and allow you to continue pumping blood into the reattached finger. So that's pretty cool. Medically important once again. Hooray, leeches. This leads us to ecdysozoa. So now we are out of Lophotrochozoa, and we're on to ecdysozoa, right? Ecdysozoa is characterized by ecdysis. Ecdysis is the shedding of an acellular outer covering. There are two phyla of ecdysozoans. One are the roundworms, the nematodes. So the nematodes. Their acellular outer covering is called a cuticle. And then the arthropoda, and their acellular outer coating is called the exoskeleton. Nematodes have a limited number of ecdysis. They shed a limited number of times before they become an adult and no longer undergo ecdysis. Arthropods have an unlimited number of times that they can undergo ecdysis, which is pretty cool. Apologies for the random artifacts of my writings here. It seems to just be a random thing that happens during PowerPoint. So that's annoying. So these are, of course, the two ecdysozoans. And we'll start off with the roundworms. Nematoda are found in every conceivable ecological niche on the planet. They are ubiquitous everywhere. You can have parasitic nematodes. You can have nematodes that are non-parasitic and just exist in the environment. And you can have nematode species that are economically important and beneficial. Right? These are extremely common. When it comes to soil living nematodes, you can have up to like numbers of nematodes that amount to billions per acre. Extremely common in the soil. Blech. So soil nematodes, extremely common. There are nematodes which we use as anti parasite nematodes. They eat economically damaging organisms. For me, I'm growing hollyhock flowers this year, and those damn Japanese ornamental beetles, those beautiful green jewel beetles, they are an invasive species, and they are hell on my hollyhock flowers. They've been eating those flowers, and they destroy them. They basically just grab onto leaves, eat them, and then crawl into flowers and have orgies and drop their eggs into the soil. You can actually purchase a nematode and pop it into the soil in August, and it will consume the ornamental beetle larvae. So that's pretty cool. There are more than 25,000 identified species. There's probably significantly more than that, like 100 times more. You probably got over 1 million different species of nematodes just because of how diverse and well adapted they are. There are at least 50 nematodes that are obligate human parasites. At least. That means that their parasitic life cycle requires a human host. So, as I said earlier, the acellular outer covering is the cuticle. This is what they shed during ecdysis. And as I said, they molt a limited number of times. It's about 4 molts before they become an adult and no longer molt. One of the classic nematodes, in fact, the one that you look at during lab, is Ascaris lumbricoides, the intestinal roundworm, right? Pictured here. They are an extremely large parasite. It's one of the most common worm parasites found in humans. They are amazing. They can crank out 200,000 eggs per day. So extremely prolific. They can survive up to 4 years outside of a host. So they can survive in the soil for up to 4 years outside of a host. At last check, these are not parasites that produce significant symptoms. So there's about 64% of people in the southeastern U.S. who have Ascaris lumbricoides parasitic infections. And as much as 20% of the entire global human population is infected with Ascaris lumbricoides. So it could be you. Other common nematode parasites that we are aware of are things like the hookworms. They attach with modified hooks to the intestinal lining. Pinworms, these can actually be seen at night when they exit the rectum for reproduction and laying eggs. Dog heartworms, anyone with a dog generally goes to the vet and gives them some heartworm medicine just as a prophylactic, preventative medicine. These worms will actually invade the circulatory system and colonize the heart. And then there's a species of roundworm that causes elephantiasis. If you want to see elephantiasis, right here. This is elephantiasis, and it is a nematode, a roundworm that is transferred by mosquito. So it infects hosts using a mosquito vector. And what happens is that it reproduces in the body tissues. It will insist in muscle. And the immune response to the presence of this parasite is inflammation and large amounts of swelling. So they call it elephantiasis because your limbs will often swell to extremely thick features. And that is literally a limb just full of millions and millions of larval nematodes. Woohoo! So There are a number of cool features of nematodes. As I talked about with the Japanese ornamental beetles, we can have economically important nematodes in agriculture. So they can be agriculturally important. What they'll do is they will feed on insects. This is actually a pretty cool system. So what happens is that it's reliant on the symbiotic gut bacteria. Butt bacteria. And the symbiotic gut bacteria in the nematodes are what actually kills the host. So they are what actually kill the insect host. So the nematode infiltrates its insect host. It penetrates it from the exterior. It does not attach to like the internal organs and parasite it that way. Instead, it just secretes a toxin that inhibits the immune response. Of the insect. And once the insect immune response is inhibited, it wildly reproduces, and the larva eat the insect host from the inside out. And it's the gut bacteria that release toxins during the process that actually kill the insect host. So that's kind of cool. So their reproduction is dependent on colonizing a host. It is insane what they look like when they're filled with nematodes. There's a nematode that parasites crickets. I'm going to take a sip of coffee here. This cricket parasite nematode will actually infiltrate the nervous system of the cricket. And when the nematodes have finished larval development, the cricket will leap into bodies of water. Crickets do not swim in water because crickets are awful swimmers. When a cricket gets in water, a cricket drowns to death. So this is not normal cricket behavior. It's the nematode infecting their nervous system that causes the cricket to leap into the water. And then the nematode can infect an intermediate snail host before finding a cricket to reinfect. So that's kind of cool. Only got about 5 minutes left, so this is probably the only slide we'll get to with arthropoda, and then I'll end up doing some previously recorded lectures. So, general characteristics of arthropoda. As far as sheer number of species, phylum Arthropoda is one of the most successful phyla in terms of species. There's more than 1 million identified species. So, more than 1 million identified species. Pretty much every time we go to somewhere new, we find new species of arthropods. So, there are significantly more than 1 million. And even at that million, that represents more than 2/3 of all identified species. They are of economic importance. They have significant impacts. These are both beneficial and negative. For instance, the mosquito is of major economic impact because it is a major disease vector. Right? The mosquito is incredibly good at transferring blood parasites between hosts. Arthropods are segmented. They do not have nearly as many segments as their segmented counterparts, the annelids. So they generally have 2 to 3 body segments. However, in some arthropods, there are way more. So they have a distinct and well-developed head with a nervous system and multiple sensory structures. All their appendages are jointed. So they have an exoskeleton, right? A large protective exoskeleton, right? The exoskeleton is a combination of chitin with various nitrogen salts and protein matrix as well. This is the acellular outer layer. It is a hard exoskeleton in most arthropod species, giving them protection. It is also the site of muscle attachment for locomotion. So, whereas our muscles attach to our internal skeleton and allow it to move by muscles contracting and manipulating bones, pulling or rotating bones. Here, muscles inside the exoskeleton attach to different jointed parts. So this is why the jointed appendages are so important. Like you, in your arthropod leg, you might have your little segment there, and then you'll have muscle attachments inside the segment. And the contraction of that muscle is what allows that segment to bend. So their jointed appendages allow movement of limbs. They have a variety of locomotion methods, right? You have swimming arthropods, you have flying arthropods, you have walking and climbing arthropods. So, just about any locomotory method you can think of, they have. So, their legs are for locomotion, obviously. Most arthropods have antennae attached to their well-developed head. The antennae are modified structures for sensory purposes. So they can sense things like air movement. They can sense things like vibrations in the ground. So they have a variety of sensory abilities via their antenna and their eyes. So that's pretty cool. Another hallmark of arthropods is many different types of mouth parts. So they can be complicated mouth parts. Insects often have just like a few mouth parts, but things like crustaceans have multiple modified mouth parts. So we've talked briefly about the exoskeleton. It is hard, protective. It is also not flexible. This means that it cannot grow in size. It cannot expand. So while it does provide excellent armor, it inhibits growth of the organism because it cannot expand. It also tends to be very heavy. Larger, heavier bodied arthropods that fly are crappy flyers. If you've ever watched a beetle fly, they are not exactly deft flyers. So, in order to counteract the fact that the exoskeleton restricts body size, they must undergo ecdysis, in which they shed the hard exoskeletal layer, and then they have their extremely soft body, at which point they can grow and then secrete and harden the new exoskeleton. So between ecdysis, they're extremely vulnerable. In addition, the exoskeleton limits the amount of air that can diffuse into the body. The arthropods have very limited air circulation mechanisms, and basically just the laws of diffusion limit the size arthropods can get. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so there we go. That's the end, because it is 12:03, and I actually have to stop this presentation because the secondary software that allows screen sharing does not allow me to see any kind of comments. So I am about to email out another link for a separate live stream so that I can see comments and answer questions. And I will stay there till 12:10.